right, we'll get started. I am obviously not Taylor, not nearly as dapperly dressed as my distinguished colleague, but super excited to be able to introduce our Wednesday seminar speaker, Dr. Erica Bruin, who is an associate professor at Hamilton College. Many of you might know her work, a great Cornell University Press book that just came out on how to prevent coups, along with a wide variety of other really exciting research on civil-military relations, coups, and policing that's appeared in kind of all the great places, so JPR, JCR, and also Foreign Affairs, among others. So excited to turn the floor over to you, and really excited for this. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me. I'm very excited to be here. And I'm going to talk to you today about my book manuscript that just came out this past year with Cornell University Press. The book is about how to prevent coups d'etat. And I think that when I first started thinking about this book project, I got a lot of pushback from people who suggested that coup attempts are a thing of the past, that this is something that happened in the 1970s or happened in the 1980s and that are not really a concern today. And so I think I wanted to start this talk by just emphasizing that the motivation for it is largely that coups do still happen. We're down from the sort of peak of coup attempts that was happening in the 1970s and 80s, but coups are still incredibly common. This map shows, this is from CoupCast, this project that's been tracking coup attempts across the globe. And this is from 2019. And this shows the countries that have had coup attempts since 1990. In the past 2 decades alone, there have been more than 50 coup attempts in over 30 different countries. This year, we've had 6 so far. The year is not over yet. Coup attempts are destabilizing events. They're not as violent as civil wars, but they do result often in a lot of repression following the coup attempt, and they themselves can escalate to higher rates of violence. They can undermine efforts at democratization, they can derail peace agreements, they can result in a lot of sort of negative consequences, both for the regime and for the people sort of living in countries that are experiencing coups. And I should note here at the outset that when I say coup, what I mean is an illegal, overt effort to oust a sitting executive from power. Coup attempts usually come from within the military. The military is the sort of actor within the state that has the coercive capacity to oust the executive from power. And so sometimes coup attempts come from non-state actors, but they have to involve some component of the current regime to count as a coup attempt. So coup attempts remain frequent and destabilizing events for leaders across the globe. In an effort to undermine or try and prevent coup attempts from happening, leaders adopt a whole range of strategies or tactics that we refer to as coup prevention tactics or coup-proofing tactics. And there's been a whole raft of research documenting how costly these efforts are. So you're probably familiar with the books that are up here. This existing work has suggested that leaders' efforts to try and prevent coups, where they have reshuffled military officers, where they have stacked the military with co-ethnics, where they have limited military access to arms, limited military budgets, or conversely tried to bribe the military by giving inflating military budgets. These efforts have a lot of negative consequences for military effectiveness. They can undermine the military's ability to carry out its sort of central task. These coup-proofing strategies can also create incentives for repression. Sheena Greitens's book focuses on how fragmenting and politicizing the security forces in dictatorships can end up creating incentives for more repression against civilians. So there are real costs to these strategies. Phil Rossler also shows that where leaders use ethnic exclusion as their strategy of coup-proofing, this can end up creating a situation where there are fewer coups in a country, but more civil wars, that risk is increased. So there's a lot of downsides to the strategies and the tactics that leaders are adopting to try and prevent coups. But I think that when I was going into this project, it did not seem apparent to me that we had a good sense of whether or not these coup-proofing strategies actually did what they were intended to do, which was prevent coups. There has been, in scholarship on civil military relations since the 1960s, a lot of work documenting the use of coup prevention strategies. A lot of this work is descriptive or focuses on situations in which leaders successfully prevented coups against themselves. And so they will talk about leaders that have remained in power for a long time despite a potential coup threat and all of the different things that the leaders did to remain in power. However, focusing only on cases that were successful doesn't give us a good sense of like which of the strategies that the leader was using is actually essentially responsible for them staying in power, or if any of them are actually doing anything, and maybe it's something else entirely. And so what I was trying to do with this book is take a more systematic approach and try and understand whether or not one of the central coup-proofing strategies that leaders use actually works. And I focus in particular on counterbalancing. This is a strategy that's widespread, that comes up in accounts of civilian control of the military over and over again. There's one famous article that sort of kicked off this recent wave of research, or resurgence of research that we've had on strategies of coup prevention, as an international security piece from 1999 by James Quinlivan called coup-proofing. And he describes one of the strategies that leaders use is the creation of what he calls parallel militaries. So he says regimes create parallel militaries to counterweight the regular armed forces that can be used against the regime in a coup. The strategy also comes up in accounts, a number of accounts of how dictatorships in particular work. So this is a more recent book by Geddes Wright in France about how dictatorships work, where they note how common it is for leaders to create a separate security force to serve as a parallel military or sort of counterweight to the regular armed forces. And so they note many dictators, some 63% in their counting, try to meet the challenge of a possibly untrustworthy military by creating presidential guards or other types of paramilitary forces outside the regular chain of military command. And so I tried to come up with a definition of counterbalancing, drawing on all of these sort of previous gestures and attempts to document this that could travel across different countries and within them over time to try and actually measure and count counterweights. And what I came down to is the sort of central features of counterweights as being security forces that are independent from the military in some respect and deployed with access to the capital. And I'll explain the reasoning for that. So in order to be effective in stopping a coup attempt, a security force needs to be able to receive orders from someone that's not staging the coup. And so in the context of a coup attempt, coup plotters typically take advantage of the military chain of command by trying to order troops to move from one location to another to seize a target. Sometimes they mislead the people under their control in an effort to make the coup go off without a hitch. And so having a security force that is independent in some respect from the regular military, whether it's supervised directly by the executive or it's under the Ministry of Interior or another sort of government body, means that it's much harder for potential coup plotters to be intercepting all of the relevant security forces during a coup. And so they have this independent chain of command that can receive orders more easily to try and subvert the coup attempt. I also count as a sort of central feature of a security force that might be able to counterbalance the military as those that have access to the capital. So the vast majority of coup attempts target the capital in a country. This is where there's symbolic seats of political power. So if you've watched coup attempts unfold on television, you can see that often their troops take over the legislature, the presidential palace. They may take over media broadcasting stations. Sometimes they arrest the executive himself or herself. And so all of these things are typically happening within the country's capital. There are rare occasions where they're not, but for the most part, what's happening is in the capital. And so while I can't identify security forces, I can't identify what the intent of a leader is in establishing a specific security force, I can identify more systematically whether or not a security force has the potential to impede a coup attempt that's in progress, whether or not it has the potential to counterbalance the military. So I focus on those two indicators. Some of the security forces that a leader might have are tied to the regime additionally through ethnic stacking, filling it with co-ethnics of the regime, through requiring party membership or having party commissars within the military that are, and security forces that are kind of enforcing a sort of ideology. Or there might be personal connections that a leader is drawing upon. So he's staffing the presidential guard with people from his hometown. Those are very common, but I think they're not a necessary requirement for counterbalancing to work. there's a whole range of different security forces that can serve as counterweights to the military. And when we read historical accounts of leaders that are trying to counterbalance the military, the different forces that they use include presidential guards, interior troops, militarized police, state-run militia, and sometimes components of the regular military itself if they pull it out from the regular military chain of command. So this picture shows, I think, one of the most well-known examples of counterbalancing. This is Iraqi President Saddam Hussein talking with Republican Guard officers in Baghdad right before the US invasion. Saddam Hussein, during his tenure in office, faced a number of coup attempts against him and a military that he ended up trying to counterbalance in a number of ways. He created a Republican Guard. This was filled with elite soldiers that he would had a direct chain of command with, so they reported directly to him, sort of pulled out of the regular military chain of command for many years of their existence. He created then a special Republican Guard that controlled in a similar way, and also the Fedayeen Saddam, a militia force. And so he counterbalanced the regular military with a bunch of different additional military and security forces that he hoped would defend him in the event of a coup attempt. Another really well-known example of counterbalancing is shown here. This is the Bolivarian National Militia in Venezuela in 2018. This force was created by Hugo Chavez following a failed coup attempt against him. He mobilized this force. He made it on par with the regular military, like made it an official part of the state's security sector. And it was largely, he was trying to recruit people who were supportive of his regime. And then he marched this force through the capital on the anniversary of the failed coup attempt. And this was a clear indication that if the military was going to try and stage another coup to oust him from power, they were going to have to then face this counterweight. These are two very different types of counterweights. So one is comprised of elite troops that were taken off from the regular military, and one is civilians that are recruited for this purpose. And so I hope this illustrates that there's a large array of different types of security forces that leaders try and press into filling this role, right? They try and counterbalance in a bunch of ways. Okay, so I create these indicators of counterbalancing and try and measure it take a look at 110 different countries across time. And so this map shows the highest number of security forces with the potential to counterbalance the military, according to my coding, from 1960 to 2010. What I think this map shows is that it's not just the most coup-prone countries that are creating these counterweights. If you think about where we see coup attempts, we had during the Cold War a ton of coup attempts in Latin America. Today, it's most common in sub-Saharan Africa and in West Africa in particular. And those are not the regions that have the most counterweights, but there are some sort of regional trends. So security forces, security sectors in Latin America tend to be a little bit more consolidated. Often regimes in Latin America will have one potential counterweight in a sort of militarized police or gendarmerie force. Sometimes during coup attempts, those forces do resist a coup, and so that's not to say that one security force can't be effective, but they're not engaging this kind of fragmenting into a bunch of different security forces. You can see some of the countries here that have the highest number of security forces that have the potential to counterbalance the military, including Yemen, Russia, India. The United States is on the higher end. We have a very fragmented fragmented set of military and policing institutions in the United States. And what I'm doing here is counting, again, only those that are deployed with access to the capital and that are independent from the sort of military chain of command. So in Russia, you have a high number of security forces, for example, particularly following the end of the Cold War, when the KGB and the Ministry of Interior are broken up into a bunch of different security forces. At some point, in the 1990s, the border guard is actually brought into Moscow as well, right, to also serve as a sort of hedge against the regular military. In India, you have an investment in a bunch of different internal security forces to combat insurgencies, but also to avoid dragging the military into politics. And so there's a Central Reserve Police Force that's built up. There's a Special Protection Group, but there's a couple other forces that are built up there. So there's a lot of variation across countries in the use of security forces outside the military, and particularly ones that have the potential to serve as a counterweight. And this doesn't follow, I think, super predictable patterns of something like it's just the most coup-prone countries that are doing this. Okay, so I've documented a little bit of the use of counterweights and how it varies across countries. What I try and do in the book is answer a couple different research questions. I think the first and most basic one is just, does counterbalancing work? Is this a strategy that actually helps leaders stay in power? And if so, how does it work? And I think this is a question that is worth answering, in part because it's not actually obvious that a Republican Guard is going to be any more loyal than the regular military, or that a militia force has the capability to deter the regular military from intervening. It's not obvious how smaller or more lightly armed forces could actually prevent the military from seizing power. And in general, it's not obvious that you wouldn't just have the same problem with these security forces, that they might also seek to seize power. And so I try to think through the sort of causal mechanisms that might be working here, and in particular, how counterbalancing might be related to the incidence of coup attempts, the outcomes of coup attempts, and the violence that is associated with them. I also investigate in the book why some leaders are able to establish counterweights and other leaders are not. This is a sort of crucial question if you're trying to understand whether or not counterbalancing is effective. In addressing these questions, I use a multi-method approach that combines analysis of kind of general patterns of what we see in counterbalancing, coup attempts, and coup outcomes, using this data that I showed you in the previous page, with case studies of coup attempts that go into much more detail and try and actually understand what counterweights are doing when a coup attempt is underway. Like, are they actually mobilizing and resisting, or are they causing coordination problems? Like, what is it that's happening when the coup attempts unfold? And so I establish basic patterns with this large N data, and then I look at the actual causal mechanisms in the case studies, and I also use those to develop and probe the plausibility of new hypotheses that I leave for future testing. And I just want to flag that the data set that I previewed on the previous slide, this is something that I published in a standalone article. It's based on a wide array of sources. I think in the end, this is all hand-coded by me. In the end, I think I put together 2,400 different academic sources, newspaper sources, some archival materials, government documents. And what I tried to do for each country is understand the sort of political context in which the security forces were being created, and to try and identify over time which forces had these specific characteristics that I noted of being independent from the military and able to actually access the centers of political power. I also code a bunch of other things about these security forces, whether they're affiliated with the regime in any way, if they're heavily armed or lightly armed, what their sort of central mission is, if they're supposed to be doing internal defense, external defense, whether they're being deployed for counterinsurgency purposes, and I categorize them in terms of the type of security force they are. Okay, so what do I do with all this? The first thing, I'm going to not talk through my answers to like every one of these questions, because that would be a very long talk, but I'm going to focus on a couple of the sort of central findings that I think come out of the book. And so the first one is that counterbalancing is associated with a lower rate of success for coups. So where leaders have presidential guards, militarized police forces, state-run militia, things like this, coup attempts against them are more likely to fail. In the book, I do a lot more complex statistical analysis. I control for a lot of factors that are thought to influence the outcome of coup attempts and the use of counterweights. I model selection effects explicitly, selection into coup attempts. I use different coup data sets. I do a lot of different things. But I think that the basic story here is actually well told by a crosstab. And so that's what I'm illustrating for you today. So what this table shows is the success rate of coup attempts broken down by the number of counterweights that a regime has. And you can see that for leaders that don't counterbalance the military, leaders that just have one security force in the military, or they have multiple security forces, but they're all under military control, coup attempts fail about half the time. Half the time they succeed, half the time they fail. Coup plotters often misjudge, right? Whether they're going to actually succeed, and so if that's possibly partly they have to plan in secret. It's hard to know how people are going to respond to a coup attempt, and so even coup attempts without counterweights have a decently high failure rate. However, when leaders start counterbalancing, when they start having particularly multiple security forces that are independent from the military, coup attempts don't succeed as much. And by the time that you have 3 or more counterweights, coup attempts are succeeding less than a third of the time. And I will just note that this is a sort of large change for something that is at least partly within the control of the regime. A lot of what we know about the outcomes of coup attempts suggests that they are often driven by chance or by the rank of coup plotters. And what we know about coup attempts is just that, like, it's very difficult to prevent those from happening. And some of the stuff that we know that makes it much harder to have a successful coup are these like long run structural features of states, like how wealthy they are, like how long have they had democratic institutions, what do they have an important international allies that are like helping prop up the regime. Those things are very hard for leaders to change themselves. Counterbalancing can also be hard to establish, as I'll talk a little bit more later about in this talk, but it is something that leaders have much more control over. So this is a big shift for something that a leader themselves might be able to do. Okay. So that's just the sort of general pattern that we see, that these are failing more often where you counterbalance. However, there could be a lot of explanations for this association. It could be there's a sort of range of ways that you could think about counterbalancing working. So there's a bunch of different sort of causal mechanisms that could be at play. Or it could be that counterweights are having no causal effect whatsoever. And so to suss that out, I go into a series of coup attempts. I first try and theorize about the different causal mechanisms at work, and then I examine 16 different cases of coups and try and identify what's going on. So just to walk you through the logic, the causal logic here, I think there's basically two categories of explanations about how counterbalancing will work. These two logics can operate prior to the coup attempt itself or during the coup once it's underway. And when I was starting to read and think about counterbalancing, what I would come across all the time in the literature was this assumption or this kind of depiction of counterbalancing that suggested that it was primarily creating a coordination problem. It seems obvious that when you have multiple security forces, multiple armed actors that could participate in a coup, that could stop a coup, that it would just be difficult to kind of get them all on the same page to stage a coup attempt, right? And that this would be then the way that counterbalancing is increasing the risk of coup failure is by creating problems of coordination. I tried to actually think through, well, what is that? When we just say coordination, what do we mean by that? And I understood the four distinct potential things could be happening. So prior to the coup attempt, counterbalancing might make it more difficult to do the recruitment that you as a coup plotter trying to seize power might need to do. If you're a senior officer trying to stage a coup, the way that you usually do it is through face-to-face meetings with other senior officers. Like, you try and get everybody powerful on board, and then you can stage a coup by just announcing it. Like, you can basically just get on television and say, well, we have taken control of the country. And you are doing this recruitment in these kind of face-to-face meetings. If there are multiple security forces deployed in the Capitol and you need to get them all on board to be able to ensure that you're having a successful coup, it's much harder to have these type of face-to-face meetings, because typically the leaders of these different security forces are not having regular in-person meetings without without the executive and without other members of the government. And so it's going to look suspicious if you are meeting with them. And so it may be that counterbalancing is associated with coup failure just because it's much harder to actually just talk to the people that you need to talk to if you're coming from a high rank within the military. If you're not coming from the sort of tippy top of the military, then often the way that you're staging a coup is by actually trying to seize control of symbolic seats of political power. You're moving troops around and trying to demonstrate that you have control of the kind of levers of state power. Where leaders counterbalance, and they have multiple security forces, typically one is charged with monitoring the other forces, right? This is typical of an internal intelligence agency, and it looks suspicious, right? Like the KGB knows if the interior troops are moving somewhere. And so that kind of more intense monitoring that can happen when you've got multiple security forces may also just prevent recruitment. These kind of things happening prior to the coup might make it so that you haven't recruited enough people when the coup starts and the coup fails as a result. During the coup itself, I think there's two different stories that you can tell. One about coordination and one about what I've called resistance. So during the coup itself, you could imagine multiple security forces creating coordination problems by either one reporting when there's a movement of troops, so not reporting on recruitment, but reporting actually on the movement of troops, Or it could be that if you actually got to the point where you've recruited multiple security forces, that they have trouble working together. And this comes up always when I talk about the one coup that we had in the very end of the Soviet Union, where you had officers from the KGB, the there were interior troops involved and the regular military, and they appeared to have some tactical challenges, like working together to actually just move the troops where they needed to go. So that's the kind of coordination story that I think had been dominant in the thinking about how counterbalancing might work. You might note that this story says nothing about the political preferences of anybody in these forces, or what. There's no assumptions about what it is that they might like. It's a pure sort of issue of that fragmentation makes things harder. However, I think that there are actual reasons why members of security forces outside the military might be more willing to resist a coup by the military. And in particular, it's often the case that other security forces see a decline in their own status after a coup attempt by the military is carried out. This often happens because there's competition within the security sector over resources, arms, recruits. Often militaries, when they seize power, they move the militarized police forces or the Ministry of Interior Forces under their own control. This happened a ton during coup attempts in Latin America, where the gendarmerie would just be pulled under the power of the military regime. This is a decline in status, and the military, sometimes it just abolishes these other forces, right? Even if there's not an explicit rivalry between them, the military often doesn't want to share coercive power within the regime. So you're in a situation where these other security forces might be very concerned that if the military is successful in staging power, things are not going to look as good for them, right? There's kind of competition there. And finally, one sort of central reason why a lot of coup attempts are unopposed by even members of the military that may not have wanted a coup attempt is that military officers are often very concerned about preventing intra-military violence. So people that have interviewed potential coup plotters or people that actually did participate in coups, one thing that comes out in a lot of those interviews and the statements that they're making is this concern about intra-military violence undermining morale, undermining cohesion, and being really detrimental to the institution. And so there's a real fear about using violence in the execution of a coup. I have other work that's documented the violence associated with coup attempts, and it suggests that more than half of coups involve absolutely no fatalities, despite the fact that the threat of force is a sort of central element of coup attempts, and despite the fact that this is the military doing something. And so there's a real concern about using force. And so the last way that counterbalancing might be working here is that it might be decreasing or changing perceptions about how costly violence appears. So it might be that if you are a member of the riot unit within the National Police, you are a member of the Presidential Guard, you're a member of a militia, that you're going to have less concerns about firing on somebody in the regular military than you would about somebody that you have lived and trained and worked with and is a member of your current institution. Okay, so there's a lot of different potential causal mechanisms that might be at work here. And what I try and do in the case studies is understand, to sort of think through the observable implications of each of these different mechanisms and see whether or not we see any evidence of them in the cases. In the book, I don't focus on what's happening prior to the coup attempt because it's very difficult to observe that, and also it's difficult to know what the kind of broader universe of cases is, and there's a lot of people who might think about staging a coup that kind of don't get to that point. So I focus instead on what's happening during the coup attempt. And I select 16 cases to look at in the book to answer this, to focus on the coup outcomes. And these cases are chosen on a most likely basis. So these are cases in which I thought it was most likely that I would see any causal mechanism happening. So they're all cases in which leaders counterbalance, right? There is a counterweight. So I'm trying to understand what the counterweight is doing. I selected them to ensure some regional and temporal variation representative of the larger universe of cases, but without any prior knowledge or understanding of what causal mechanism might be at work. And the basic idea here is that it actually took a lot of work to try and reconstruct these coup attempts. And so I had no idea going in whether or not either of these mechanisms were at work. I looked at 12 coup attempts that failed as predicted, so sort of on the line cases where if there's any causal effect, I should see it in those cases, and 4 that succeeded. So for their off the line cases that succeeded despite counterbalancing to try and understand what was going on there. And I'll just show you a summary of the case evidence from the the failed coup attempts. So this is the set of coup attempts that I selected from the sort of broader universe of cases that I identified. And what I found in looking at these cases is a lot more evidence of that would be consistent with a resistance sort of logic than a coordination logic. I mentioned earlier on the coup attempt in Russia in 1991, and this is one in which there do appear to have been some coordination problems, but there's also been people who are disputing this account. And I think if you think about why the coup attempt failed, the actions of civilian actors in that case appear to be more appear to carry more weight than the like sort of tactical problems of these forces coordinating with one another. I saw almost no evidence in other cases of coordination problems, either where troops were getting intercepted as they were moving places, or recruitment was started but couldn't be completed. I didn't see those problems sort of coming out, even in places where you have just really detailed kind of play-by-play attempts of like who's moving where and who's recruited who and who's talking to who. Got memoirs of coup participants, all sorts of information I'm drawing on here, and I just don't see a lot of evidence of that. What I do see over and over again is that in these cases, counterweights are often the first ones mobilizing to actually defend the regime. And so this isn't in every case that I examine, but it happens a lot. And often they're the ones moving before anybody in the regular military moves. And so in some cases, coup attempts fall apart. You have a pretty common dynamic where you have coup plotters who will announce the coup, or they will seize control of a building, or will seize, arrest the executive. Everybody sits still for like 2 hours. Then often the Ministry of Interior forces, a presidential guard, or a militarized police force will attempt to retake one of these targets that have been captured, or to free the executive. And at that point, then you see an opening up, and other members of the military will start getting involved as well. And so it's not that the counterweights are the only people ever resisting, but they're often the ones who are like willing to get off the sidelines. And so in some cases, they're the only ones. In other cases, the military is also resisting, but it's usually after. And so just to give you one example of this and how this sort of plays out, one of the coup attempts that I look at is this 1971 coup attempt in Morocco. And this is an incredibly violent coup attempt. This happened during a birthday party that King Hassan II was staging for himself, where it was the commander of this military academy, and another high-ranking general, that recruited cadets at this military academy, some of whom it's not clear whether or not they knew what was happening in their participation, or they're just following orders. But they stormed the presidential palace in the midst of a giant sort of birthday celebration. It was an incredibly violent attack. They were able to actually arrest and hold the king. And when this happened, most military officers adopted what was described by some observers at the time as a wait-and-see approach. They just sort of sat there and were trying to see what was going to end up happening. The coup ended up failing when the interior minister decided to rally the troops that he had under his command to try and retake coup targets. And so there was a series of security forces that were organized under the Ministry of Interior, a Sûreté Nationale, Gendarmerie, and a mobile intervention force. And these are the forces that went and tried to retake targets that were captured by coup plotters, and to seize control in particular of the Summer Palace. After the coup attempt failed, and in a radio address the day after the coup attempt, the king himself noted that it was these forces that played a really instrumental role. So he notes during this radio address that rebels had taken over the Ministry of Interior, by which he means the actual, like they took over the building, like they were aware the Ministry of Interior forces were going to be a problem, but they had not actually cut off the specific individual security forces. And so that was the sort of central misstep that he's pointing to. So in some cases, in many cases, these forces are actually actively resisting and defending the regime. Okay, so there's a bunch of alternative arguments that I try to consider in the book, alternative explanations for the association that we see between counterbalancing and coup failure. And I've just highlighted the two that I think are most plausible here, and why that I think in the end they're not actually as good of an explanation as the idea that counterbalancing itself might be doing something. And so the first counter argument is that there's going to be some resistance to a coup no matter what, that there's not really going to be any difference between what counterweights are doing and what the military is doing. This view of a coup attempt suggests that it's clear pretty quickly whether or not the coup is going to succeed or fail, and everyone's going to kind of bandwagon on the side that's succeeding. And so this, I think this case is made more forcefully in this great piece by Holger Albrecht and Ferdinand Ebel in their recent sort of piece about the dynamics of coups. This is not what I saw in the cases that I examined, either in the failed cases or the successful cases. So I will just note that here, I'm just showing you the ones where the coup attempt failed as predicted. I also, as I said, looked at 4 where the coup attempt succeeded. And in those cases, there was some resistance by counterweights. In other cases, there were basically the coup plotters did a good job of cutting off communication between the regime and the counterweights, or physically blocking their access. So there's a coup, for example, in Bangladesh, where they just like surround the militia headquarters, and they can't do anything. They've been head off. In any event, this is just to say that's not what I see in the actual case evidence. I don't think that's consistent with the findings. A sort of bigger concern here is that it might be that some other factor is explaining both the use of counterweights and the outcomes of coups. And I think the most obvious potential explanation here is something about the strength or weakness of the military in relation to the regime itself, right? And so it might be that the only situation in which a regime can create counterweights is where the military is too weak to resist it. I noted that often militaries don't like these forces. This is a very hostile form of coup prevention. Often there's rivalries. Often leaders are actually siphoning money off from the regular military to give it to these other forces. Sometimes they're channeling the best recruits to them. They're giving them better weaponry, better barracks, etc. So it might be that leaders can only do that kind of stuff when the military is already too weak to try and stop them. And then that same weakness then explains why the coup is failing, right? And so there's the responses that I have to this is just that there's a bunch of different ways that you could think about actually measuring military strength or weakness in relation to the regime. And none of the things that I can think through, that anyone I've talked to can think through as potential sort of indicators here, have any correlation with either the use of counterweights or the outcomes of coups themselves. It's not the case that larger, better resourced militaries, or ones that have a bunch of political power, like they have a bunch of military officers in positions in government, there's no correlation between any of those potential indicators and the outcomes of coup attempts. There's a lot of chance in the outcomes of coup attempts. Part of it is about who's actually staging the coup, but I just see little to no correlation there, and so there's no relationship that I can see. And also, as I noted from on the slide that has the map, there's not a lot of evidence that there's a strong relationship between the kind of how powerful the military seems to be and whether or not there are counterweights. And so I just don't see evidence of that. I also do some work in the book to model selection into coup attempts explicitly, because you would assume that a military that is weak also would not stage as many coup attempts. And so when you try to explicitly model that, the results, the association I see between counterbalancing and coup outcomes is still there. Okay, so that brings us to the question of coup attempts. And here I think this is where I have findings that tend to be pretty surprising to people, which is that even though counterweights are associated with a higher rate of coup failure, they do not appear to deter coup attempts. The assumption in much of the work about how leaders stay in power points to this idea that coup plotters are taking into account their likelihood of success. That seems like a pretty safe assumption when deciding whether to stage a coup. And so it seems logical that if counterbalancing is associated with a higher rate of failure, that militaries would start to be concerned about staging coups and might refrain from staging coup attempts. I don't see any evidence that there's a decline in the coup attempts that are staged. This table breaks down the sort of total number. These are country year observations and the coup attempts that are happening, and so the percent of country year observations with coup attempts. When you have no counterweight versus yes, some counterweights, you can do this again with the kind of different measures of 1, 2, 3 plus counterweights. And there's basically no difference here, right, between 5 and 6%. If anything, there's slightly more. This is not a statistically significant difference. Where I do see a difference is in regimes that are trying to create new counterweights. And so many leaders come to power with an existing set of security institutions that they are not trying to do anything with. Some at independence, a lot of countries inherited militarized gendarmerie forces that have the potential to counterbalance the military. Other leaders did not inherit those. Some leaders just take over from regimes that had a very beefed up presidential guard force or a militia force, and they're able to sort of just take those over and continue those. Other leaders try to create new counterweights. And what I see is in the year following counterweight creation, there's a higher incidence of coup attempts. So you go from across all country year observations, about 5% of them that have a coup when there's no counterweight creation. And when you have a counterweight creation in the following year, there's some 14% of those observations have a coup attempt. So there, if anything here, it appears that counterbalancing is associated, the creation of a new counterweight is associated with a higher incidence of coup attempts. It does not appear to be having a deterrent effect. And I will note that in the case evidence, I came across a lot of examples of coup plotters specifically talking about how angry they were by efforts to create new counterweights. And they talk about this as a sort of central motivation of some of the coups that they are staging. This is one example. This comes from the 1966 coup attempt in Ghana that ousted Kwame Nkrumah. He had created a presidential guard force and was also trying to agree that, well, so there was a presidential guard force that existed. It's called the President's Own Guard Regiment, but it was a largely ceremonial force. He expanded the force, he beefed it up, he gave them gave them higher salaries, they had better weaponry, they had better equipment, and he tried to create it into like a powerful counterweight to the military. He was also talking, but had not really done this, about creating a new militia force that would eventually replace the military. He was thinking about this and kind of talking about it, hadn't actually done it yet. And so what you get is a lot of grumbling from within the military. The military is incensed about this idea that the presidential guard is going to be taken away from them. There's a whole series of meetings that Nkrumah has with senior military officers where they keep insisting like, well, okay, but the presidential guard is still under our command. And he's like, no, it's not. No, actually, I am the one that has operational control of it. So you're getting very frustrated by this happening. And there's also this concerns about the militia. And so the military actually ends up being able to recruit among the police who are also feeling sidelined by the creation of these counterweights. And they stage this coup attempt that succeeds in ousting Nkrumah from power. And there's a bunch of speeches that are given, radio addresses and public speeches about why the coup is being staged. So this is by the sort of central coup plotters. This is the U.S. Embassy sending back a report on listening to John Harley, who's the commissioner of police and who's now deputy chairman of the new coup-appointed regime, where he's giving a sort of public address about why he staged this coup or why they staged this coup. And the first point here is that Nkrumah is trying to centralize power he's a tyrant centralizing powers under his own hands. The second point here, and what is a multi-point agenda, is that he's saying Nkrumah raised a private army in flagrant violation of the Constitution. He armed this army with the most modern and lethal weapons. All of the national army was neglected. He later decided to secretly disband the army and replace it with a militia formed by fanatics. And so they're expressing slight anger about this, expressing fear about their own position once these other security forces are created. They're worried in particular that there's going to even, not just that the army is going to be neglected, but that it might be disbanded. Okay, so there's many other, the coup plotters in this case, they talked a lot about what they were doing. And other coup plotters, also pointed to this, saying there's a plan to build a second army. This plan involves gradually strangling the regular army to death. Another coup plotter said all this emphasis was on this is the POGR, the President's Own Guard Regiment, while the rest of the forces suffered. So there's a lot of public complaining. And one thing I will note is that there's not really incentives for coup plotters to be talking about these forces and their complaints with these. It looks very self-serving for them to be doing this, right? They're not saying he's leading the country into economic ruin, he's undermining national defense. They're saying all this, the other forces are suffering, we are suffering when you were putting all these resources on. So I don't think they have incentives to be blaming the counterbalancing when that's not actually what's happening. Okay. I will obviously note that like with coup attempts, there's potential other arguments about coup, or with coup outcomes, there's alternative arguments related to coup attempts. And the two of them in particular that I try to address in the book are whether or not counterweight creation is just indicating that coup risk is high, and whether military strength can explain both counterbalancing and coup attempts. And so I will note that, it's possible, right, that if you're a leader and you're thinking about counterbalancing the military, you're going to do this when you face a coup threat. That seems pretty obvious. But the risks of counterbalancing, that the military might stage a coup to then oust you from power because they're so angry about this, is in the forefront of a lot of leaders' minds. And so there's been other work, including by June Koga-Sudith, this 2017 piece, that finds that actually at higher rates of coup risk, leaders are less likely to try to do this. And so a lot of the counterweights that we see are kind of historical legacies from prior regimes, and they're not, it's like pretty rare that leaders are actually trying to establish these new forces. The analysis of the coup attempts in the book, I'm not going to go into detail on those in this talk today, other than the one in Ghana, but the analysis of the coup attempts that are happening in those circumstances do suggest that coup plotters are at least talking about this as a central reason that they're intervening. They might be disassembling a little bit, like they might be blaming this if there might be something else going on behind the scenes, but like this is what they're talking about, is that they're actually angry about this. And I don't think that these fears are unfounded, right? Given how frequently counterweights are being demobilized or even disbanded following a coup attempts. So they're talking a lot about this. And then another potential sort of counter argument here is about whether or not military strength vis-a-vis the regime can explain both why we have counterweights and why we have coup attempts. But again, this is the kind of inverse of the last relationship. And the last sort of counter argument about the strength or weakness of the military, again, we don't see many correlations between indicators of military strength and the incidence of coup attempts or the incidence of counterbalancing. These are, there's a lot of reasons why people stage coups, and there's a lot of reasons why regimes have counterweights, and it does not seem to be at least a very direct explanation that would, I think, explain the other findings that I have. Okay, so there's many other findings in this book. I mentioned that I was trying to understand why some leaders can establish new counterweights when others cannot. And I find in response to that question that embedding counterbalancing in a broader coup prevention strategy that involves compensating the military if you're rather than taking funds away from them, that involves ethnically stacking the military or purging people that are disloyal. Basically, if you're trying to do a whole bunch of things at once, you can often get this through. Whereas if you just try to create a counterweight on your own, you are often going to get a coup attempt to try and disband that force. And this is a look at a structured focus comparison between leaders that were successful at establishing counterweights and leaders that tried and that failed, that are operating in similar kind of political and economic circumstances. I also find that establishing militarized police forces is less likely to provoke this kind of backlash from the regular military. And in part, I think the explanation here is just that it's very easy to look at the military and say, like, we're establishing this militarized police force. It's not a counterweight. We're doing this because we have an insurgency, or we're doing this because we're concerned about terrorism, or we have this extra money that's coming from the United States. This is a big funder of these like militarized police forces. And so establishing militarized police doesn't provoke the same sort of reaction. But these forces do often resist during coups. And then finally, one implication that the book explores in a couple of cases is that because counterbalancing works primarily through the mechanism of resistance, at least in the cases that I've looked at, this suggests that coup attempts that happen in where there's counterweights are going to be more violent. And there's also reasons to suspect that the coups are going to be dragged out. And this can create a situation where you get coup attempts that actually escalate into things that look like civil wars to us. Counterweights can serve as a kind of pre-organized source of resistance for an ousted ruler. This happens in the 1962 civil war in Yemen, where the ousted imam is able to draw on all these tribal forces and members of his presidential guard that defect, and he's got this like ready-made rebel group. But it could also just make the actual coup itself devolve into something that we are counting as a civil war, because it starts including civilians, it starts getting really violent. So I look at some coup attempts, one that did not escalate and one that did escalate in the Dominican Republic in the early 1960s. Okay, so what can we say, I think, taking this all together about whether or not and how counterbalancing works? I find evidence that counterbalancing does impede successful coups. Like, it does make it harder for you to seize power successfully, but it's a risky strategy for leaders to pursue. Creating new counterweights can provoke this backlash from the military, and it can increase the risk that coup attempts that do happen escalate to civil war. More broadly, this type of coup prevention tactic does not do anything to sort of change norms about military intervention in politics, right? This is a kind of hostile strategy of coup prevention that doesn't actually change any of the thinking within among military officers about what their role is. And so I don't think it's a sort of long-term solution to try and preventing coups. However, given the sort of decline that we see in the rate of success when you have counterweights, its ability to impede coups means that it's understandable, I think, why leaders continue to do this, despite all of those costs that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, right? Despite the fact that it undermines military effectiveness, creates incentives for repression, a lot of negative consequences. But if you as a leader are looking at the situation and thinking about consolidating your security sector or keeping it fragmented, fragmentation here has obvious benefits to you as a leader. So I think it's understandable why leaders continue to try and do this. Okay, and thinking about the sort of broader implications about this, on the one sense, this is a kind of this is a study of like one specific coup-proofing tactic and whether or not it is effective in preventing coup attempts. But I think that more broadly, this is interesting because it highlights a way in which rulers themselves can affect the likelihood of regime survival. This is something that is in some respects within their control or within the control of the predecessors who created counterweights. It identifies a sort of alternate causal pathway to civil war. Some 25%-ish of civil wars do not start by like rural insurgency, but split off from splits within the military itself or coup attempts that like escalate, right? And so this is a kind of decently large category of civil wars. And the book gives us some explanation of how when those coups are likely to escalate in that way. And finally, it just emphasizes that there's a lot of variation within state security sectors. We have had such an amazing sort of resurgence of work on armed actors outside of the military, outside of the state security forces. We know a ton about rebels and militias and paramilitaries and how they relate to one another and how they govern. And there's been a tendency to, I think, lump together state security forces and not think about the relationships between them. But they're very complex. There's rivalries, and the relationships between those forces can affect the outcomes of challenges to regimes. Looking ahead, I think one thing that I did not think about when I was starting this book project was that this book would be coming out in a moment in which people were wondering about whether or not there's a coup attempt happening in the United States. And the book does not talk about the United States. The book is about countries in which more traditional coup attempts are happening that look more like the military trying to stage power. But what living through this past year has suggested to me is the real limitations that we have had between scholars of civil-military relations who focus on the US versus focus on the comparative politics of civ-mil, and between those of us that study coups and those of us that study democratic backsliding, and that we have been pretty siloed in our research and not thought a lot about how we might talk to one another. And so one thing that I think is important to think about is the extent to which the causes and dynamics of traditional coups, which is what I've been focusing on, might differ from the dynamics of self-coups, where a leader tries to perpetuate themselves in power. And in particular, to think about whether or not counterbalancing and other coup-proofing tactics might also impede other anti-democratic actions. And I'm very excited to talk about this in the Q&A if anyone is interested. But my sense is that counterbalancing helps leaders stay in power by preventing traditional coups, but actually undermines their efforts to stay in power through a self-coup. Finally, I noted that militarized police might be the kind of like line that you could walk here as a leader, that you could establish a militarized police force and there's going to be less resistance, but they actually do to their establishment, but they actually seem to work. And so in my current project, what I'm focusing on is trying to understand the spread of militarized policing around the globe. This is new data that I've collected about militarized riot and tactical units that in 170 different countries and when they were established. And I'm trying to understand why their establishment in some instances, or why the military is supportive of their establishment in some instances, but violently resist it in others. So I'm sort of digging into that question. And now I know I've talked too long, so I'm just gonna say thank you so much, and I really look forward to your questions.
So why don't we open up the floor to questions, both from the Zoom world and also from the room here. So you just want to stick your hands up and I will jot down names. Susan.
Okay, this was a really great talk. Obviously, I'm very interested in this work, as you know. So I take your finding that resistance is the key mechanism and not coordination. But I recognize that a lot of your cases are Cold War cases, except for the Libya and the Chad case. I think I'd call the Russia 1991 like the last breath of the Cold War. And so my question for you is, are coups organized differently in the 21st century, in that groups organizing them in the military can use different coordination mechanisms through communications technology, but also that counterweights, if they're intelligence agencies, have access to more like signals intelligence equipment to be able to impede them?
Go ahead.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for these questions. It's definitely something that I've been thinking about a lot, particularly with the spate of coups that we've seen in the past year. And I think that there are certain things about the dynamics of coups that are definitely different. I think it's less possible to say today that the dynamics of coups are entirely within the military, that are internal to the sort of military, because even military officers that are in sort of restrictive circumstances, like they're barracks, they don't have access to social media, they're like prohibited from accessing these things, they are getting a little bit more information, and it's not just like what information is coming to them from the military chain of command. They're out on the streets interacting with people who are showing them social media and things like that. And so I think that there's more of a chance in coups today for civilians to affect the outcomes, both for civilians to affect the outcomes of coups, and I should say also to create circumstances in which coups are more likely. So coups today are happening often in the context of mass protests, in which there is some signal, this is like serving as a signal of frustration with the regime and things like that. That said, it still typically is the case that it's armed actors that are determining the sort of outcome of the coup attempt. So the military can decide to listen to civilians who are calling on it to oust a president, or can refrain from doing that. Military can decide to, or members of the military or security forces can decide to use force to try and stop a coup, or they can decide not to. And so it's typically, I still think that the sort of general idea of how coup attempts succeed or fail is still a decision that's it's like largely being made on the basis of who within the military or security forces is going to be willing to resist. And so I think that there's more of a role for civilians today, and that is a sort of distinction, that you can have information that's getting to soldiers that's not just through the military chain of command. But I still think that the kind of general incentives for them of like, is the situation going to be better for me if this coup succeeds? Like, that is a calculation that like they're looking at what they think the military is going to do. And we're still in a situation where there's a ton of competition between these security forces. And so, for example, in Guinea this year, there's a coup where like there's a ton of rivalry between the special forces and the regular military and other security forces in that situation. And that rivalry is causing some members of the military to support coups and members outside the military to like oppose that. And so I still see those dynamics happening today, despite the fact that there's like less of an information bubble. Does that make sense?
Dick Samuels.
Oh, thanks for the terrific talk. I appreciate it very much. A question for you, something you sort of mentioned but didn't spend much time on, which was U.S. intervention and covert action in the form of coups. And I wonder if you could say a bit about that as a category. In the universe of cases you examined, how important was it? And I wonder if you could just think aloud, speculate with us about whether or not the proliferation of counterbalancing forces, of security forces, would play into the hands of a malicious foreign power seeking to destabilize the government. They'd have more opportunities, more targets to use to manipulate and to bring down an unfriendly regime.
Great, thank you so much for these questions. Yeah, so especially when we're talking about, so this, the data set is like involves a lot of Cold War coups, right? And so you have both the United States and the Soviet Union who are actively trying to foment regime change, and sometimes through coups, sometimes through other mechanisms. What I largely see in the cases that I've looked at is that external involvement is not typically shaping the outcome of the coup itself, because it's usually not like US forces are on the ground and they're going to like help, or Soviet forces are on the ground, but they're subtly or not so subtly encouraging or discouraging particular actors within the military who are approaching them about staging a coup. And so I have one chapter where I look at the coup attempts in 1962 and 1965 in the Dominican Republic. The United States is clearly very invested in what's happening in the Dominican Republic. They are very concerned about the direction of the government. Is it going too far to the left? They're very supportive of coup attempts in those circumstances. And then in 1965, when a coup attempt happens, the militarized riot squad defends the regime. It devolves into a ton of violence, and the U.S. ends up intervening to basically stop that situation. What I see in those circumstances is like the United States being willing to signal that they're not going to oppose a coup attempt by local actors, and sometimes providing some material support, right? Like if you hear we're channeling some money or some funds or something like that to this situation, but not actually doing a lot to guide the outcome. The 1965 U.S. intervention in the Dominican Republic is an exception in which they were, I think, partly concerned it was just devolving into a civil war. It's usually a much more subtle sort of intervention. And so I actually don't see these as a separate category of coup attempts because so much of what's happening during the Cold War in particular is very internal to the politics of these militaries and the sort of other security sector actors. And so they're often happy to take support from abroad, but they're not, it's very difficult for them just on the basis of external support alone to be able to have a credible coup attempt. And so I think that I feel like I am very interested in what the United States is doing, and they're pouring a ton of money, particularly during the Cold War, into building up militarized police forces. And I think that they're doing that without any understanding of how that's actually going to affect the dynamics of coups, because in some cases they are both invested in counterbalancing, or they don't think about it as that, they're just invested in building up militarized police, but also invested in a particular regime and power or a particular type of coup. And they don't, they're surprised when then the militarized police will try and undermine the coup attempt. And so I feel in the end, they're putting a lot of money on the table, and they're often sending signals to people about how the coup is going to be received, but they seem to be doing less their involvement seems less relevant for the outcomes of the coups during this period than I think I would have expected kind of going into this. And then is the proliferation of counterweights actually, available then to a malicious foreign power that wants to do something? I mean, so I have spent some time in the sort of U.S. archives and thinking about U.S. training and equipping of foreign security forces or support for them. I do not see a lot of recognition of the complex politics of relationships between the security forces, and then often the U.S. has been we have had separate police training programs, and then there's separate, all the rest of the money is going to the military, and there's not a lot of sense of that these aims might be in tension with one another, and that there's not, I think, a lot of sense of how particularly training up militarized police forces is going to affect civil military relations. And so I don't see situations often where the U.S. is building up a sort of riot unit or a militia or something and then trying to manipulate that force. We often see that they're building up these units or providing money to these other security forces because they think they're going to solve a different problem, which is they're going to control riots, or they're going to control, they're going to combat an insurgency. And they don't appear to be, in at least on paper, thinking through as much the implications for civil military relations and control of the military. So this is kind of, a nefarious idea. I think that there would be room here for this, but at least during the Cold War period, I don't see a lot of actual efforts to leverage these other security forces by foreign powers. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. My question is about the context during which coups occur and whether you see any difference in coups that occur when counterbalancing forces are already mobilized, let's say against a civilian protest, versus when they occur in an environment where they aren't already mobilized on the streets, and then whether that would make a difference in whether the coup succeeds or not.
This is a really good question, and it's not something I've tried to look at systematically. We do know that coup attempts that are happening in the context of ongoing opposition tend to be more likely to succeed because there's a clear signal that there is popular support for ousting a current regime, or at least reforming a current regime. And so what I would assume is happening in those cases is that there is actually tension between the counterbalancing forces and the protesters, and then the military decides to take the side of the protesters. And so it's often these counterbalancing forces are the ones carrying out day-to-day repression, and so they often have a worse relationship with civilians than the regular military does. We did see, however, I'm thinking about what happened in Bolivia in 2019 with Morales, and there was basically a ton of repression of protests happening by the police forces. The police start to defect and just walk away. They're some of them join the side of the protesters, some of them just walk away, particularly walk away from the presidential palace. And at that point, there's a lot of pressure on the military to be doing something. And so the police do sometimes defect, but in general, I think they have a worse relationship with civilians. And so if anything, in those cases, I think it allows the military to blame the other forces and to be we're acting on behalf of the people. And so I think a good next step for this research is to try and look at this more systematically and do we see what's happening do we see that counterweights are going to stand down more in the context of ongoing protests? And I suspect that is correct. I suspect that they are less effective in that context. Because everybody already seems, so many civilians already seem on board with ousting a regime, and also that it's typically, they're the target of a lot of popular anger is typically against those forces. And so they have their own reputation also to be like concerned about. So I suspect that it is different, and I'd be really curious to take a look at that.
Sure, thank you very much for the talk. The question that I have is actually on the relationship between the US military and militaries in other countries, particularly post-Cold War. We have lots and lots and lots of close ties, training programs, all kinds of associations. And an element of that, when I talk to my friends in the military, is commonly an effort to export American culture on these issues to the militaries with which we interact. Do you have any advice based on your studies on how our work, US work in that area, might be altered or improved? Looking to Turkey, looking to the School of the Americas in Latin America, and other cases. There are some cases, of course, where it doesn't apply very well. Myanmar would be one. But for those where there are close associations, your advice to U.S. Department of Defense activities.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is something that I've been thinking a lot about, in part because like the U.S. just is so invested in training foreign militaries and partnering with them. And a lot of what the U.S. is trying to do is not just improve material capabilities, but actually change norms, and in particular, impart norms of democratic civilian control of the military. This is something that I was just reading the work of Renana Joyce, who's a scholar who's studied a lot about like what's actually happening during those training sessions. And one thing that she's pointed out is that often the norms of the United States, the kind of cultural shifts that the United States is trying to put forward, are in tension with one another. And so one aspect of this training is like democratic control of the military. So you shouldn't be, intercepting, like you should be following orders, right? You shouldn't be deciding to stage a coup or disobeying orders that are coming to you from civilian authorities. But at the same time, there's also training on human rights practices, and that you shouldn't be doing this repression. And a lot of the militaries that are getting this training then are in a situation where they're getting these are often conflicting, right? Because civilian authorities might be directing the military to do some repression or do things that seem to be human rights violations. And so one thing that she shows is just that like that's where you get like the United States is actually in the end not all that effective at helping change cultures or change norms, in part because the things that we're saying can be contradictory. And so that's a sort of big challenge in those circumstances. And I don't think that we've got really good guidance about this training programs for foreign militaries are not telling them like, okay, well then you're asked to repress the protesters. This is what like you should do that would be in line with democratic civilian control of the military, but also not repress it. Like we're not walking through those specific scenarios. And so I think that like my advice, partly just drawing on Renana's work, would be like thinking a little bit, like understanding that basically what we're telling them to do might be, that we're telling them to do two different things, and that those things might be in tension with one another, and to actually be trying to think through what would be the best course of action in those situations. And I think this is complicated also by the fact that often the United States has got competing aims in training foreign militaries and in dealing with other countries, and that the United States to this day continues to be supportive of coup attempts that oust leaders that we don't like, right? That oust leaders that are adopting foreign policies that appear to be contrary to American interests. And so I had a project a while back where I was just documenting statements by U.S. leaders, by secretaries of state, and the president across multiple administrations in response to different coup attempts. And you just see over and over again, coups that are thought to be favorable are not described as coups. They're like, oh, well, the military is helping. The military is like helping usher in democracy in this country, which is very contradictory. So we are not set in our, like, the United States does not have a consistent anti-coup stance, and then the actual training of military forces is giving them sort of competing things. And so I feel like my only advice here would be for people that are involved in training of foreign militaries and security forces would be to be acknowledging that we're giving them contradictory directions in some senses, and to think about the circumstances under which we are prioritizing one of those versus the other, and to have a more of an acknowledgement of how investments in the security sector, which we are also doing through different means, are affecting the military as a whole. I often see surprise among U.S. policymakers. This comes out in some of the archival materials about U.S. efforts to train police forces abroad, where like the U.S. often has this, what I think of as a pretty false distinction between military and police forces. We tend in the United States not to want to use the military domestically. We think police are for domestic disputes. And this is historically actually in the United States not been as clear of a division as it should have been, and definitely in a lot of other countries that the United States is engaging with, there's, the military is growing out of a domestic police force. Sometimes these police forces have been siphoned off from the military, sometimes they're under military control. This is just not as much of a distinction as we think. And so funneling resources to building up militarized police forces, whether for counterterrorism aims or for fighting insurgencies, which like we've spent a lot of time and money doing, affects the standing of the military, the resources available to them, what their role conception is, in ways that I think U.S. policymakers funneling this money did not quite understand. And so I feel like this advice is like nuts and bolts, but like this advice is basically just like recognize that we have competing aims both in our training of the regular military, and that when we are funneling money to these other security forces, that this can create competition and tension within the armed forces that might undermine our sort of broader goals. And so to recognize that it's a complex situation, and relationships between these forces are often ones of competition.
So Erica, are we in fact indulging in a conceit when we say that the net effect, our engagement, resources, support, the training is in a sense pro-civilian control and democratic?
So, possibly. So it's hard to have a sort of overall assessment of what the sort of net effect has been. I will say that at this point, we have trained so many different militaries that like almost anybody who stages a coup has received either U.S. training or training from another, even if you're speaking on peacekeeping operations, they've been trained by French forces, or they've been trained, at this point, it's so ubiquitous that I can't be like, well, U.S. training is actually like enabling coups, because everybody's getting training. And so I think it's not that strong of an explanatory factor. And so that's not what I would essentially go to when I'm trying to explain the sort of when we're seeing coup attempts specifically today. I am pretty pessimistic about like our ability to actually improve military capacity anywhere, and our ability to change norms about civilian control. Like, I don't think we know how to do it. And so I don't know what the policy implication of that is, other than to like be less ambitious with our aims, or recognize the sort of the limitations that are going on there.
Perfect. So we've got 15 minutes and about 5 or 6 questions. So I'm actually going to group questions. So we'll turn to Julian first, and then Nina Miller. We'll take those two at once.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. I wonder if you might clarify. So you've done a great job of isolating this mechanism of resistance. But even within that, right, I can think of a couple of different stories as to why that prevents coup success. So is it that these forces are like themselves winning the battle? Are they like physically stopping these coups from happening? Or is it that they break the momentum, right? We know that momentum is important for coups. That's why they, do everything at once in the Capitol. So is it just that they sort of like break the momentum for long enough for other forces to get in and then they win the fight? Or do these people actually have to be able to win combat encounters?
Thank you so much. This has been so interesting. So I was hoping you could discuss sort of the scope conditions for this a little bit more. Is this just a story about authoritarian regimes? And I sort of think it isn't, probably. And so in that case, like, how do you expect regime type to affect decisions about counterbalancing options available to leaders, the actual incidents or outcome of coups, if this is really just the legitimacy of the regime and things like that you could expect to be related to regime type?
Thank you. Do you want to answer these?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. These are really awesome questions. So the first question from Julian. So you're exactly right that there are multiple mechanisms that could relate to resistance. And I would say that like in most cases, they're breaking the momentum of the coup. In some cases, they are actually winning. And so in cases where there's multiple forces under the Ministry of Interior, those forces are actually often militarily capable enough to stop the the coup that's in progress. And that was the case in the 1971 coup in Morocco that I was mentioning. In other cases, like the 1965 coup in the Dominican Republic, we have a situation where this White Helmets riot squad is just, they put up the first resistance, they eventually get kind of crushed, they go home, and then the Air Force decides to like bomb the presidential palace. Like all of a sudden, all these other military officers are in place. And so I think that like I've seen both in the cases that I've looked at, and I wouldn't, I feel like I don't, with the research design that I used, I couldn't tell you which of these mechanisms is more prevalent, right? And I also cannot tell you, to be clear, whether or not coordination is happening prior to the coup itself, because I'm only looking at stuff that's happening during the coups. And so I think that would be like a good step for future researchers to be sort of thinking through what are the conditions when we would expect the stuff happening prior to the coup, but then also thinking about like how could we tell apart these different potential resistance mechanisms. And so yeah, I have examples of both thus far. I will note that like very poorly armed, or not poorly armed, but like very small presidential guards are often capable of stopping the coup, in part because sometimes when coup plotters get any resistance, they just like give up. They might be very concerned about violence, might be very concerned, they might just think that this was going to be easier than it was going to be. And so sometimes it doesn't, like, you don't have to have these counterweights have the military capability to like defeat the regular military. It's usually that either the coup plotters like fold very quickly, or they just breaks the momentum, and then you have something else that's the other forces that are getting involved. Okay, in terms of scope conditions. Yeah, so I definitely think this is something that is also helpful for leaders in democratizing regimes. So in the book, the scope conditions are, I limit it to cases of countries that haven't been like long-standing democracies. So countries that have been democratic for less than 50 years at the time of when I started this project, so in 2010, it's a little while ago. So that includes a ton of countries that at this point have been democratic for a long time. I include India, for example, where this was a deliberate strategy of rulers post-independence. They were looking at what happened in Pakistan, and rulers in India were very concerned about preventing the military from becoming a dominant force. And so you have this massive expansion. This is my dissertation advisor, Steve Wilkinson, has written a book about this, Army and Nation, where he focuses on how deliberately rulers in India post-independence were building up the Central Reserve Police Force. There's a couple other security forces that they're building up as well, specifically to try and keep the military out of politics. So it's definitely something that can happen in democratic regimes as well. In terms of patterns across regime type, I find that democracies do it as much as many other authoritarian regimes. Where I see a real difference is it's military regimes that do not do this. And this is partly because military regimes come to power, they centralize everything underneath them, or they disband the other security forces. Military regimes don't last for a very long time, though, and so this doesn't usually end up having long-standing implications. But part of the reason why we saw Latin America on the whole being, I think, involving fewer counterweights is that they were all starting with like a gendarmerie force. Under a military regime, that gendarmerie was taken under the military control, and then at the end of military regimes, they were typically separated out again, but it was often a long enough period of time that nobody else in power was trying to like counterbalance the world. So there is variation across regimes, but I see the biggest difference between military regimes and everybody else. Some democracies do use this.
So in the last 9 minutes, we're going to group 3 questions. So start with Lieutenant Colonel Mark Hamilton, then we'll go to Mina, and then last but not least, Bryce.
Thanks a lot for your discussion, David. It's really interesting. Talked a lot about military leadership, specifically talking about military, general officers. But did any of your data sets look at a military that was comprised together via conscription versus an all-volunteer force? Were there any correlations with that data?
Thank you for a really great talk. I liked how you looked at the political preferences, and I was wondering if you could talk more about loyalty, and if you think they're more inherently loyal, or is it a very self-serving loyalty? And also, like, if those conflict, like saying hypothetically, like the leader conceded to the coup plotters, do they keep standing out of their own self-interest, or do they stand down because they're like loyal?
Interesting. Okay.
Thank you so much. I was going to ask if there are particular attributes of counterbalancers that are successful versus counterbalancers that are unsuccessful. You can touch on it a little bit, so if there's more to add, let's hear it. But the other thing I'll ask is it possible for some regimes to essentially use inter-service rivalries as the counterbalancing tool?
Yeah.
And there's a case I'm thinking about, I think in Japan, where there's an army unit that tries a coup and it's the Navy that stops them. Professor Samuels will correct me if
Yeah. Excellent. All right, so let's take all these three.
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys for all these fantastic questions. I want to go in reverse order, I think here, which is to start with the inter-service rivalries and to say, yes, you can definitely counterbalance through inter-service rivalries. I think it's less likely to be less effective because the cost, it's not going to change the cost of violence, I think, as much as violence between forces that are actually distinct. And typically coups are staged and stopped by ground forces. And so it's sometimes you have a situation where there's like additional ground services that are created, but it's I think I can count on one hand the number of times that like an Air Force has been involved in it. Maybe it's two hands, but it's not that many where like Air Forces and Navies have been involved in coup attacks. So it's just not as common, and I think it's likely not as effective because other services, they're still in the military chain of command, right? Like there's still like a joint chiefs position, or there's like something where they're like supposedly in this sort of setup. And so creating a totally separate like Ministry of Interior, Home Affairs, creating a security force loyal to or supervised directly by the president or the executive, I think creates a different set of institutional interests related to that force that makes it more likely that those would be the most effective ones. I will note, however, that like much of the quantitative work, so before I did this book, before I like collected the data, the security forces, all of the quantitative work on counterbalancing was using data from the military balance, which counts as counterweights, inter-service rivalries. They're constructing these indicators using that. And a lot of the kind of most counterbalanced states that they were thinking of were ones that have these sort of inter-service rivalries. I just don't see that as a pattern that you have different services frequently like defeating a coup by another. Like it just does not seem to be something that comes up in coup narratives. There's these two great projects right now that are creating coup narratives. So we now have like 500 coups in the post-World War II period. We have two totally separate data sets that have created coup narratives. And so you can go through and see who it is that's like actually resisting, which is really cool. This is the Colpus data set that's who is doing this? John Chin, and I can't remember his co-authors. And then Jonathan Powell and Clayton Tyne, who did the coup data set that I use in the paper. And so they have separately this sort of set of coup narratives you can go through and see who is resisting. Attributes of successful counterweights. So one thing that I thought was going to happen was that counterweights that were tied to the regime through personal, party, or ethnic loyalties were going to be more likely to, those types of counterweights were going to be more effective, that they would be associated with a lower success rate for coups. And I did not find that. And what I think is probably happening is like anecdotally, I think those types of counterweights are more likely to resist, but they're less effective. They often resist, but they're less effective because in those cases, the leader has typically tried to ethnically stack the entire military in addition to security forces. They're typically using ethnic exclusion, or they're in a party regime in which like there's only one political party that is the sort of primary one. And so it's creating a situation where like people might have personal ties to that leader, but it's clear if that leader is being ousted, then like there isn't going to be support for sort of defeating this coup, that like things can happen really quickly. And so you might get resistance, but then people basically just like go home. Like they abandon their weapons and take off their uniforms, and like if they're part of the leader's militia, personal militia from his hometown, like they just abandon what appears to be a sinking ship. So I don't find that those are more successful. I do find when I disaggregate by like the type of security force, that like presidential guards are presidential guards will defend you. They're pretty effective in doing that. Militarized police are pretty effective. And secret police are pretty effective. And so like when I disaggregate, those are the ones that are significantly associated with a coup failure. Okay. I'm going to jump, I guess, around to conscription. So this is a great question, and I have not looked at it. And I know I have a friend that's collected great data on conscription cross-nationally that I should talk to him about this, and we should see. I feel like my instinct is that like counterbalancing is going to be that like counterbalancing is probably more likely in places where there is conscription, because it prevents you from trying to actually ethnically stack the regular military. And so you might then just have to do it with these other security forces. But that is just an intuition, and I would love to look at the actual data on that. So thanks for, I'm writing this down for future work. And then the question about loyalty, like, are they actually loyal? Like, what are they doing? And so you do see circumstances in which the counterweights, like, they have developed institutional interests that's distinct from the military, but they're not tied to this specific leader in any way. And like, they don't want a coup to succeed, but they're also not like they're not going to risk their lives in the end for it. You have, when leaders are tying security forces to them through particularly personal ties, so they're recruiting people from their hometown or their clan or their ethnic group, so ethnic ties and personal ties. Like those forces, like coups that are happening where those counterweights are exist, they tend to be bloodier. I don't think, again, that they're more successful. I did not see that in the data, but I do see that basically they're more willing to, in riskier situations, like be just using violence to try and prevent the coup from succeeding. What I don't have a great sense of is like, what I would like to be doing, so I'm talking to Kristen Harkness, who's collected a bunch of data on ethnic stacking practices within the military, and she's used my data and has coded it now for a bunch of security forces. And one thing we would like to do is sort of put things together to think about the specific type of loyalty that's cultivated when you're ethnically stacking the military, and how this changes incentives to resist or not resist during coup attempts, and whether or not, for example, counterbalancing is more effective when you have ethnically stacked the military. Like, do these, from the perspective of a leader, do all these like good things go together, or are they sort of, is counterbalancing actually undermining those sort of ethnic stacking or loyalty mechanisms that you might be happening? We do not have the answer to this yet, but I think these are great directions for future work. And I think more broadly, one thing that we're thinking a lot about is that I and several other scholars that have been working in this area have tended to view coup-proofing tactics as this like interchangeable menu of tactics that you could be like a leader being like, well, should I ethnically stack, or should I counterbalance, or should I deprive the military of weapons? And I think there are kind of broader patterns of like what goes together, and the kind of broader strategy that leaders are taking towards their security sectors as a whole. And this isn't a critique that Risa Brooks pointed out. She had a recent annual review of political science piece on civil military relations where she was like, guys, you are all, this is too disaggregated. They're like, you should think about kind of broader strategies that leaders have in relationships with their militaries and security sectors as a whole. So partly what we're doing, I think me and other people working in this area are trying to have a broader, put our work together and think about more broadly, how is a leader approaching, what is their approach to trying to stay in power, and what kind of combination of tactics are they kind of putting together to try and get there?
Well, thanks so much for a really exciting talk, and please join me in thanking Erica for this amazing talk. Join us next week. I think Audrey Cronin is our guest speaker.